My name is Kurt Gutfreund, and I was in the Holocaust. I was 2.5 years in Theresienstadt. My story begins when I was born, January 6, 1938. 2 months later, Hitler marched in and annexed Austria to Germany. My father was taken from us on May 9, 1942, and was shipped to a place called Malé Trostenetz. Upon arriving, they took him off the trains and marched him into the woods and executed there. My mother and I, we went into hiding. We must have been apprehended towards the end of 1942. And on my 5th birthday, January 6th, we were sent to Theresienstadt. Theresienstadt was a ghetto, a camp. Theresienstadt was not an extermination camp. It was a work camp. It was a way station. Most people were there for 2 months, 3 months. Like my grandfather, he came on the first transport to Theresienstadt from Vienna, and 3 months later he was sent to Treblinka, where he was killed. My mother volunteered to split mica. Mica is a mineral that was used in the 30s and 40s for electronics. And I believe that's the reason that we were never shipped on from there to the east. A lot of people in Theresienstadt from there to the east. And in the beginning, people didn't really know what the east meant, that it meant basically death. And I wanted to go with my friend. It was my best friend. And I said to my mother, I don't want to be alone. I want to be with my friend. And my mother said, no, no, we have it halfway decent here. We're going to stay here. But eventually, like a good mother, she gave in. And we went on the train. And because we weren't on the list, and the Germans, as you know, kept very good records. They knew exactly what happened to each person. And our name wasn't on the list. So they slapped my mother in the face and threw us off the train. Otherwise, we would have gone probably to Auschwitz. There were 15,000 children that came to Theresienstadt. And out of those, 242 survived. And I'm one of the lucky 242, and on a percentage, that's 1.6%. Theresienstadt was liberated May 8th, 1945, which happened to also have been the last day of the war. And we were liberated by the Red Army, the Soviet Union, Russians. And they came into the camp with the tanks. And I remember seeing some of the SS guys running away from Theresienstadt. There were death marches from the camps in the east. And there was a lot of typhus conditions and bad conditions. So my mother decided we're not going to wait for reparation. We're going to walk and hitchhike to Prague. Prague is only about 40 miles, 70 kilometers from Theresienstadt. And from there we took a truck back to Vienna. My childhood after the Holocaust was pretty much a normal childhood. You know, at the time, things weren't great in Austria. There were food shortages, etc., etc. So I was, I think, for a couple of years in a children's home in Vienna, and I went to school until the age of 14. At that time, I wanted to quit school and learn a trade. And I wanted to become a businessman. And my mother said, if you're not going to school, you must learn a trade with your hands. Now, why did she say that? Because when in the camp, people that had a trade had a better chance to survive than a businessman or a lawyer or even a doctor. You know, she was worried there may be another Holocaust coming. And so she wanted me to either get an education or become somebody that can do something with their hands. So I apprenticed to become an optician, but I wasn't very good at that. And the day I was finished, I never worked at it again. And at the same time, at age 14, I applied for a visa to the United States. And the visas were issued strictly on the basis of what country you were born in. And the Austrian quota was taking 5 to 6 years. So I put myself on the list. I could have gone to Canada right away, but I put myself on the list, and 5 years later, the list became clear. They said you have to have somebody that gives you an affidavit that you wouldn't become a burden to the government. And my mother was one of 3 girls. Her oldest sister went away from Vienna, and she wound up in Bogota, Colombia, and eventually she came to Chicago. And my aunt that had moved from Bogota, Colombia to Chicago, her husband did that, and I came in May of 1958. My first job was selling men's clothing at $1 an hour, which in 1958 was the minimum wage. And after a couple months, I started to earn a little more. I went on their training squad, and I became eventually an assistant buyer in children's clothing. And eventually I left the store, went to work for Children's Wear Wholesaler, eventually bought the company, changed it to an import company, and I basically lived the so-called American dream.
And why do you think it's so important to share your story and share what happened during the Holocaust to this current generation?
Well, you know, people forget, and if we don't teach the next generation, it will be forgotten, and we don't want it to be forgotten, because it's a bad thing that happened, but bad things still happen. Unfortunately, people forget about the past. So we want to make sure that at least some of the Jewish people know about the Holocaust.